I'm Susanne Schuler, Director of Training and Consultancy at CEDR. I'm also a mediator and conflict engagement specialist. We received lots of interesting questions after the webinar on psychological safety we gave. We couldn't answer all of them during the webinar, but we promised you that we will answer them as a follow-up. One question was, how do cultural differences impact what people view as rude? So that is one of those questions where I felt the person who asked the question might want to know, what is the recipe I need to know to get it really right, and have almost like a category, a list of, if with this difference, you have to do that. So it's all about difference, and it's about the individual, the team, and the organization. So you have to discuss in the team with each individual what differences and expectations are there. And then you create together what we would call a team charter with acceptable and unacceptable behaviors, which is true for that specific team in that specific organizational culture. So we use a model, that's our mediation model, and difficult conversations to do that, and also a model from Professor Milton Bennett, how to manage differences. And there you go together through stages from actually denying that there is a difference at all to hopefully accepting, yes, we are different, which does not mean that we have to be all the same. It's then the question, how do we leverage that difference to create a high-performing team? Because as we know, good conflict is the license to innovation. So you need difference, and there are lots of studies and research out there that difference is important to create something new, if you know how to leverage it, how to handle it, and constantly work on that. So yes, there is a way to deal with differences, and no, there is not a unique recipe, but that gives you actually the beauty of creating something new, which you don't know beforehand. How do you work with a colleague who is good at their job, but who expresses extreme personal views you find abhorrent? Yeah, what to say about that? It's, first of all, it requires courage, because if you work with someone and you find their personal views abhorrent, which is a strong word as well, you can either, I think 3 options, you can avoid talking to that person, and you can go in full attack, or you can have a third option where you put all your confidence and courage together and have actually a conversation. And there might be a few conversations, because if someone has strong personal views, there is normally always something behind that. So there is one technique which we use, which is nonviolent communication. You actually express in an I message how you feel. So when you say ABC, I feel that you don't respect that, and I think that you have not the full picture. Please, when you utter your personal views, do it in a way that we can discuss. It's just an example. I think I don't want to give like the ideal formula, but there is a way that you can express in an I message what you feel and think about that, and it's not a blame, it's actually literally how you feel about it, and then you explore together why someone has those views. How do you address instances of hepeating? I also experienced some moments of sheep-eating, so that might be now also an issue. In any event, if it's hepeating or sheep-eating, hepeating happens more often, is important that you do something in that moment. That requires some preparation, because we women, especially, we have experienced that millions of times. So you know when it's happening. So you need to prepare, rehearse ideally with someone beforehand, how to call this out. How can you disrupt that pattern in that moment? Because very often the person doing that is not even aware that they're doing that. So it's catching that moment and say, oh, hang on a moment, isn't that what I just said? Thanks for reframing what I just said. It's really kind of you that you explain it again with your own words. That shows me that you understood what I just said. So these are sentences you could use if you, like me, I like some humor, you can use that. Important is that you find a non-aggressive way to call it out. And ideally, if you have in a meeting and you know there is a person doing that, you might have some allies in the meeting who speak for you. So it's important to prepare yourself, but also find allies. And I know from experience with female colleagues, when we are in a meeting together, we normally help each other and are already prepared to do that. And then it's often the reaction I get is that someone says, "Oh, apologies, I didn't even realize." And then you can have a really good conversation afterwards. And if someone still does it, then play the broken record until they understand. A good question: how do you work on creating psychological safety in a predominantly remote team? So if I'm honest, we've been working in remote teams for the last 30 years. So in a global organization, and I've been working in global organizations for the last 30 years, there was always a part remote or hybrid. The same rules apply for a remote team like for a in-person team, with some extras. So you need to have regular contact. So you need to really engineer, and you have to do that with any team, touch points. They're informal touch points, they're formal touch points, and now with all the technology developed over Corona, it's almost normality that you have all these channels, electronic channels to do that. So it's about the regularity, the check-in. With remote teams, it's even more important that you have these scheduled one-to-ones with your team, and that you have events. So ideally you have at least one in-person event per year where you can reconnect. But we have here at CEDR some examples of remote teams where managers really have a true connection. And if they meet in person in the office, it's sometimes amazing. You think, have you ever seen each other? No, it's the first time we've been working now in person together. It's also important that you create a team charter, which we do with every team. When you start working together, set out some ground rules. What is acceptable, what is not acceptable? How is everyone comfortable working remotely as well? So that you have those rules really clear and responsibilities, and that everyone has also good equipment so that you can do events online as well. So the tip here is remote teams is not necessarily more difficult. It's just a different way to communicate and to find different channels to do that. What is the link between psychological safety and diversity and inclusion? Is one a prerequisite for the other? So when we talk about the levels of psychological safety, how Amy Edmondson coined them, inclusion would be the first level. And I would say inclusion and psychological safety are both interlinked and are both, if I call them, verbs, meaning you have to continually do something about them. You can't just say, oh, inclusion, tick off automatically psychological safety. Because especially in teams are fluid. There might be new team members you need to include again. You have to work with other teams. So if you want to reach the level of psychological safety, you always have to work on the inclusion, which then leads that people can actually learn, contribute and challenge. So that's always the line. So it's like a virtuous cycle. And if you create an environment where people feel included, even those you would normally exclude, comes again to how to deal with difference and hear difficult messages as well. That is the level you want to get to. And how my colleague Andy says, it's like going to a gym. You start with a certain weight, and then once you manage that, you can lift heavier weight. Same with inclusion, I would say. So once you learned how to do it, you can advance. And you actually go, when I go back to Milton Bennett's scale, you can go from acceptance to actually integration. You make deliberate efforts to adapt your communication style, your conflict style, your work style, to make it easier for others to engage with you. You open up to people you would normally find abhorrent or you would not agree with, to really explore what they want to say and what their underlying needs and interests are. So you go to a level which again requires courage. You go out of your comfort zone and you feel comfortable with that. So inclusion for me is a constant process of being really comfortable to get out there, to stretch you and to find a new level and to find the license to innovate. Please feel free to connect with us and continue asking questions, because we see that as a start of a dialogue and we learn from each other. It's not a tick box exercise that you can say, psychological safety, done, I have the recipe. It's ongoing exchange and conversation. And as mediators and communication experts, we live from that mutual feedback. So thanks for your questions, continue giving them, and let's stay in touch.